Welcome to an evening presented by the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences, and also really inspired by and thanks to the work of Shannon Harvey and her company, Elemental Media. And the purpose of tonight's event is to discuss features or things that the film touched upon, so aspects of the film My Year of Living Mindfully. Before we sort of formally get underway, there's a few sort of things that I would like to do. I'd like to start by acknowledging, show my respect and acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, the elders past and present on which the meeting, I guess, takes place. That will be varied depending on where we are. Nonetheless, it is borrowed land. I will introduce the different panelists tonight and also myself. So I will be the, I don't want to say moderator because it's really meant to be a discussion panel and question and answer. So I'm a senior research fellow in clinical psychology, and I'm also the deputy director of the Brain and Mental Health Hub at the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne. We've also got joining us Tim Goddard, who's a psychotherapist, the director of Open Ground, which is an Australia-wide network of clinicians and teachers offering programs like Mbsr and their sort of close counterparts. She's also the founding director of the Mindfulness Training Institute in Australia and New Zealand. We additionally have Dr. Neil Bailey, a research fellow and head of the Mindfulness Neuroscience and Mental Health program at the Epworth Center for Innovation in Mental Health. And Patrick Carney, an independent Dharma teacher who has trained chiefly in the lineage of Mahasi Sayadaw of Burma, which was a central reviver of the mindfulness meditation tradition in the modern world, and one of the sort of sources and foundations for the approach that is used in the mindfulness-based stress reduction program championed by John Kabat-Zinn and championed here in Australia by Tim Goddard. Patrick is initially trained in the Diamond Sangha lineage of Zen Buddhism. So I've seen this question now in a couple of different contexts, and it incidentally was a question that I had kind of already posed early on. But the first question I'd like to address is to Tim. And I think the reason that sort of this question is of particular interest to me is that in the film, Shannon's first real kind of transformative experience was in the context of an Mbsr course, which I believe was hosted by Open Ground. And so it's quite interesting that, Shannon has noted this a couple of times, that she really didn't see or really didn't feel or notice the major benefits, I think, of the practice until she was really engaging kind of fully in the way that one does in Mbsr, on the order of 45 minutes per day of practice. And so the question, I guess, that I'd like to pose to Tim, of course, I'd be happy to hear from the others on the panel and may add some responses of my own as well. But the question is, to Tim, what do you think is the importance of engaging in a program such as Mbsr? Why do you think that, amongst those looking to learn mindfulness, what's the benefit of engaging with something like Mbsr over the plethora of alternatives that exist in sort of the mindfulness and meditation space?
Yeah, great, Nicholas. I suppose Mbsr, but it's not only Mbsr, it's lots of other courses that have kind of come out of Mbsr, MBCT for depression and mindfulness integrated, CBT, like these courses that kind of encourage people to leap into practice and kind of hold them there while they find out about lots of things. I think one of the things, like Shannon started off doing apps, right, when she first started her mindfulness journey, and lots of people do, like they're available. The problem with apps, I think, or books is that they carry with them an immediate expectation that they're a kind of thing that's going to help you relax. And sure, a bit of practice is going to help you activate the parasympathetic nervous system. But as soon as any persistent unpleasantness arises in the practice, which it's surely going to do, because the thing you're paying attention to is your own stress. The reason you came to try and do an app is because you're feeling stressed or a bit of anxiety or sadness or whatever, or pain. So that's going to be there when you start paying attention. And it's very adaptive for humans to go, bugger it, that's not helping because I'm just feeling myself bad. That's problematic if you haven't got a context in which you've set up a bit of an experiment, and the experiment in MBSR or MBCT, MICBT is some consistent practice of long enough so that you get a handle on noticing that pleasantness and unpleasantness arise. So that, John Kabat-Zinn captures some of the kind of insights from Buddhist psychology, saying life sucks and sings, everything changes, don't take it personally. So it's as soon as you make that discovery or the investigation of what is unpleasantness a kind of framework for examining what's arising in you, then you're in a whole different ballpark. And all of these courses, like Buddhist psychology, I think, are, because they're kind of a kind of secularized drawing from that body of work and understanding, are really inviting people to make unpleasant experience that usually we're very averse to, make that a kind of playpen of investigation and learning how to relate to it differently. So I think that's the kind of, the other thing is, of course, you get a teacher, which you do in many other contexts, and I'm really interested to hear Patrick speaking about his role as a teacher in retreat contexts and otherwise. But I think having someone who has committed to you and is kind of curious about your process, and also understands something about the context of your practice, why you're doing it, and the constraints you might have, I think that's just gold. And in these courses, I think there is a lot of emphasis on belonging, connection, and the teacher kind of following you through the 8 weeks to see what happens and help you with obstacles, basically. Yeah, so I think this thing of a teacher can really connect and help you practice to interrupt that kind of, it's unpleasant, I'm going to just not do this, I'm going to go and do something else which makes me feel pleasurable in the moment. So I think that's the heart of it, about why something like MBSR, Shannon found, the teacher calls you to practice for 45 minutes. It is unpleasant for a lot of people. And she kind of did it. Yeah, so that would be what I see as the most useful.
So I guess picking up on that, some individuals have asked, I think it sort of seems logical to sort of then transition to asking Patrick kind of the next step. For a number of people, and I know this sort of has been for a long time, this has been the Center for Mindfulness kind of approach, once you finish MBSR, or whatever the equivalent is, as you've mentioned, Tim, that sort of you need to go to, historically I think it was the either the Bari Institute for Buddhist Studies or Insight Meditation Society, and sort of do an intensive retreat. And I guess, Patrick, what are your thoughts in terms of it? And Tim, obviously as well, I'm sure you have thoughts about what there's sort of been developments of an MBSR too, and perhaps the gap between MBSR and retreats maybe is a bit wider than we think. But I'm curious, Patrick, what do you think about when is it appropriate for someone to sort of go on retreat, and when is it not appropriate, and what is the likely benefit of going on a retreat, and how is it different from kind of home practice?
Well, like Mbsr, what you get in a retreat is you get a systematic training. And for me, meditation is very much a craft. So it's a skill that you develop over a period of time, and it does take time to learn it. Some people are fast learners, some are slow, some are in between. But it really helps to have a group of people around you who are practicing with you, who you can bounce off. So when I do retreats, we have a practice workshop every morning where we introduce a new aspect of the meditation, and then people talk about their experience. And when you meditate, you know your own experience, but you don't know anybody else's. But when you meditate in a group and people are talking, you get a sense of, oh, that happens to other people. I'm not completely mad, which really helps. Plus, having a teacher, in other words, having someone who understands the craft better than you do, and to have a one-on-one feedback session is immensely valuable. And that's where a lot of the learning really takes place in that context. As for who should do a retreat, basically anybody who wants to. Because you don't know how people are going to respond. You have to give it a go. And of course, you know that you can always walk out. It's not that you're locked in.
Yeah.
and you know that you're going to get a lot of support while you're going through a difficult situation. So you're in a room with a number of people, and it's pretty obvious as the retreat progresses that other people are having a hard time too. If I'm having a hard time, but other people are having a hard time, and we can do it together. So there's that group support is really important. That and the guidance from someone who actually understands the craft. So you're not going to get like, for example, to be suddenly faced with something very unpleasant, which creates a great deal of disturbance in the mind, in the emotions. It's easy to conclude it's not working, I should leave. But you might discover that actually this is a sign of progress. You're going deeper, and therefore you're opening more up. Now here's how you work with it. So it's tremendously valuable.
So there's a question here that I think is quite appropriate about, so someone stated that they've tried MBSR courses twice and didn't find it to be particularly beneficial. And I guess the real heart of the question is, do you believe that there are people or particular situations where, and I don't think that this necessarily is just for MBSR, but I think any type of meditation, do you think there are particular situations where, it just may be ineffective or may not be helpful? And I'm curious, I know, Neil, this is a question that you've started to think about quite a bit in research. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that the studies that have shown benefits from meditation, and there are a lot of studies that have shown benefits, they're reporting average benefits. So that doesn't mean that every single person will experience that improvement in mental health or improvement in brain activity. It's a bell curve, and some people on the bell curve, even after having gone through a mindfulness Mbsr course or retreat or anything like that, might actually still show mental health or brain activity that remains below the average of the control group, the non-meditation group. And they might even show worse mental health. The thing that the research is showing, though, is that on average, people's mental health does improve. So we can't say that, going to a meditation retreat or mindfulness retreat, MBSR course, any of those things is definitely going to work for everybody every time. But what we can say is that on average, people who have gone through these retreats seem to have a higher probability of having improved mental health and altered brain function as a result at the end of it.
I guess there's a couple of things I'm thinking. One to do with some selection bias. The number of individuals that are coming to many of these retreats, many of these courses, many of these programs, are potentially often seeking an alternative means of, healing themselves or helping themselves. And there's a sort of one of the top questions here really is that, Shannon mentions the possibility of, specific practices being prescribed in a particular way for particular conditions. And I think this is an important thing that we consider in that, that really the kind of knowledge that we have in areas of, say, psychotherapy, or that, or we'd like to have in psychotherapy, I guess we're kind of starting to get there, but that we have in other areas of medicine where, we're actually well positioned to prescribe a very specific practice for a particular type of problem. I'm not entirely sure that we have that data in the context of meditation, at least not from a research perspective. So, we're kind of seem to be fumbling about, and I think the kind of gold standard, if you will, is to just prescribe things like MBSR just because that it's what we know the best and we know the most about. I'm curious though, Patrick, what do you think? This is something you've talked about a little bit, sort of about, and I'm curious from the traditional teacher perspective, is there kind of, is there knowledge? Are there general recommendations? Is it, because I know, in the Mahasi Sayadaw tradition that that there are some sort of signposts about the progression that people, you kind of expect people to go through. So how are these kinds of things of sort of tailoring or customizing approaches to meditation? How is that dealt with in the traditional practice sphere?
Traditionally, it's more, I think, a case of the free market, that people turn up. They're attracted to some particular approach, and so they go and try it out, and it may or may not work for them. And certainly you get situations in which a person will come to start a particular style of meditation and realizes this is not the style that they're interested in. And sometimes that's pretty obvious early on. Sometimes it might take some years to recognize that. So a certain amount of shopping around, in practical terms, a certain amount of shopping around is necessary. And it's really up to the individual what they connect with. And I think it's, what I like to tell people is that they, the students, are in charge. So if you think it's not working for you, well, then try something else. It's not that there's one thing at the beginning of every retreat, I really try to hammer the message. There is no such thing as the one true technique. There is no one method of meditation which is going to work for everyone. So it's up to you as a student to find what's the method that suits you. And for some people that involves shopping around. For me, I could say the first 5 years or so were my shopping around period. And eventually, or quickly, depending on circumstances, you find something that this is what I want, this is what works for me. And so you jump in and you do it. In the classical Mahasi approach, it is a very specialized form of meditation practice for a very specialized purpose, aimed at a very specific population, rather like in that sense Mbsr, because that's a package designed with a certain population in mind. So no technique presents itself as being the universal technique. You've just got to work out what style suits me and then do it.
Yeah, and I really resonate with what you're saying, Patrick, and I think there can be a bit of a skewing of a medicalization of mindfulness in a way, like, there's questions about, and Shannon talks about this in the movie, I think, is, could we get to, offering particular patients a particular technique for a particular thing they're suffering. And I wonder about the use of a dear colleague of mine, Maura Kenny, who's a mindfulness teacher and psychiatrist in Australia, just pointed out to me that evidence-based in medicine actually means the integration of the best information from current research, which you and Neil are over, experience, clinical judgment and patient preference. So it's a bit more like what Patrick's saying. It's sort of like, I don't know that this thing can ever be nailed down by research studies. It's going to be like, so many people in our world can't even get access to this. Why would they have the time or money or interest? Like, it's a particular way of looking at suffering, and even to be curious about your suffering. Many people come to things like Mbsr because they've tried a lot of other stuff and it kind of hasn't worked. And they get engaged in this thing and find it doesn't kind of work in the same way they want it. But what they do get is an investigation into how to bear that maybe in a community of people. Like, maybe this is something to do with the nature of things and making a different relationship with your particular patch and what you're carrying in your mind and body, which I don't know. Yeah, of course I'm in the scientific paradigm, but I really wonder about us imagining that, like, it's about people's curiosity and where they go and what they're going to find out. And I'm not sure we're in charge of, sure, we have to make sure things are safe and efficacious enough or whatever, but I have a question mark about that kind of trying to make it. I really don't like the undermine of people's agency and subjectivity. Like, they're finding out some stuff about, and some people find netball great, some people find Christianity great, some people find Buddhist psychology great. Go, enjoy what you enjoy.
Absolutely. It's one's relationship to one's own experience.
Yeah, and that's what we're investigating.
That's the key.
Yeah.
And if that can be stimulated by a meditation technique, fantastic. If that can be stimulated by netball, fantastic.
I do. One thing I wonder, and there's a number of elephants in the room, if you were, that I think we'll get to. The issue of access and equity. I think, and this is something, Tim, you and I sort of had some discussion about, and certainly this comes up a bit in the film, and particularly with the sort of idea in the refugee camps. But not everybody is able to shop around, so to speak, and the market, as it were, for meditation practices is quite a complicated market. And I'm not saying that that's it's not untrue of other areas. Certainly, this is just nature of life. But this intertwining of science and many of the individuals who sort of are kind of promoters, as I sort of think of them, of meditation or mindfulness, has to some extent there's sort of a convolution, I think, of the scientific findings and what they may mean, and the potential biases, whether spoken or unspoken, among the researchers to find positive results, then promoting particular techniques. So I wonder, it's how, and I think, this certainly, I feel it a bit more personally in that, my background training is as a clinical psychologist. And so, if someone comes to me and says, what can I do? What will help me? I feel I have an obligation to say, well, based on the evidence, this is what's most likely to work for you, as opposed to just saying, there's all these different things you can try, have at it. And I mean, that's to me, it's a big challenge, because I think, on the one hand, I agree that you have to spend some time investigating, exploring, and figure out what will work for you. But on the other hand, we need clear guidelines. We need a way, so particularly in this, and there's a whole other issue here about the medicalization of these practices. And I think there needs to be a clear line of it. If you're doing these practices for the purpose of personal growth, if you're personal exploration, things of that nature, that's very different than if you're using them for managing mental health and promoting well-being and things of that nature. So I think there's probably a delineation that's important there. But as we start to think about people that are coming to their GPs, that are coming to their psychologists, that are asking, well, what meditation ought I to try? And my personal experience since I moved to Australia has been, I've had a number of GPs recommend various meditation apps to me, clearly not knowing anything about my position or my background or my experiences with a number of these apps and the companies that run them. Which I sort of have just found myself laughing at that and wanting to put some of my papers on their desk and having to resist that urge. But it is a challenge. I think that what we know about a lot of these studies and what we know about a lot of the studies of things like Mbsr, and even a lot of the studies that have been done in meditation retreats, is that it's a very select sample. Oftentimes these are well-off individuals. They're usually quite educated. They can afford to go, and that's a whole other thing. I think when you come to Mbsr, you come to retreats, who can afford to commit 2 hours a week? I don't think it's ridiculously expensive to buy into an Mbsr course or go on retreat, but it costs money. You have to have, if you have kids, you have to have someone to look after your kids. You have to potentially have time off of work if you're going away. So I think I'd be curious to hear other people's thoughts on the panel. Like what do you think about this kind of equity barrier, and how do we think about that? How do we approach that?
It's a really good question, I think, with regards to the science, where the majority of studies are done on university students. And so I'm not sure if that's the case for mindfulness research across the board, but I think it's true for most science, psychology-based science at least. And so if we're doing so much testing on university students and then trying to generalize those findings to everybody else, sometimes the results just don't actually generalize. And so, yeah, definitely I would say the research needs to put much more effort into having sort of a diverse range of people undergoing these mindfulness interventions to confirm that it might be a universal approach or maybe not. And I don't think we have a good answer to that yet.
I suggest that from the traditional perspective, it's definitely not a universal approach. That from the point of view of the tradition, it's only ever a minority, a rather small minority, who even show any interest. much less would survive the first 10 minutes. So from the point of view of the tradition, you're always actually working with an elite. It's a self-chosen elite. I mean, these can be very poor people, but most people in the experience of the tradition are not really interested. They won't, if they begin, they won't go very far with it.
Would you say, Patrick and Tim, that commitment to the technique and the practice might be the sort of most defining factor?
Yeah, and where that commitment comes from, and that's a real puzzle, especially like Tim was saying, it's natural for us to avoid the unpleasant and go for the pleasant. If you embark on mindfulness meditation, at some point, you're going to be hit with really unpleasant stuff and can be quite threatening. And then where's the motivation? Like, basically, where's the faith? Now, you might have a faith in a purely science-based model. I've got this whole pile of studies, and they all tell me that this is good. I got the impression in the documentary that Shannon had kind of had that pile of studies, in a sense, was her Bible. So I know this is okay, because look at all these studies. And that's a major source of motivation in the contemporary world. But that might only take you so far before you really start to have doubts that are so great that you back off. And that's where the relationship with the teacher and the community comes in. That if you've developed those human relationships, then that kind of grounds you. And you think, okay, I really can go through this. I can do this. And it's a good thing to do because I can see these other people who have gone through this process. And I would like to be more like them. And this is the role of community, which is really important.
Yeah, and that's so much the way in MBSR. I mean, in MBSR, all the studies show that I think if you ask people to do an hour a day, they end up doing about 25 minutes a day. So people, not everybody does 45 minutes like Shannon does. But it is so motivating, Patrick, in the MBSR context too, because people are, I've had someone with absolute chronic insomnia who after the first week didn't do much practice and then committed. Next week did body scan twice a day, comes back in a week and says, I've slept for 3 nights in a row. And everyone goes, what? Because this guy was completely wired. So people see that and go, oh, I want a bit of what he's having. Oh, I have to do that bloody practice, Damn. But so the group process and watching people who are really up against it. I mean, I really have a lot of pain around the equity problem because certainly in how I offer MBSR, it costs money and we give huge discounts to people who can't afford it. So most people who ask can do it for $50 if they want. If you can afford it, do pay the full fee. That's how we keep it going. But so we do get some diversity in our groups in terms of people who have money, not money, but it is that I think it's quite heart opening for someone, just different contexts of the kinds of suffering people have, to see each other and really engage and hear people's stories of what people are up against. And yeah, the context of a group going through that and hearing each other's stories is really powerful and motivating. Of all sorts of things. I think of mental health too. I don't think there's been enough research on the effect of that kind of group, whether it's in a retreat setting where you're actually hearing from people and feeling connected, or a Dharma, gathering, or MBSR, I think, or MBCT. I think a lot of the power of it might be this intimacy that you get kind of on tap, really. There's always some extroverts who are prepared to share enough so everybody starts to feel safer. So it kind of works well.
Well, I would agree really strongly with you on that, Tim. I think the fact that many of these teachings, and historically, if I'm not incorrect, Patrick, that historically it's often been to some extent a group enterprise. You sat around and listened to teachings, right? So there's always been this sort of interesting group element of you're learning about suffering and how to end suffering together, and to see the throngs of other people coming out to hear the lecture on suffering and how to end it sort of signifies to you to some extent, there's a lot of other people that are interested in this. It's not just me, and I think it's been woefully understudied. I think that and there's been this idea, and part of the promotion of sort of things like apps and self programs and online courses that worries me a bit, because you lose that group element to some extent. And I think there's been a couple of organizations that have really tried to promote this idea of trying to keep some group element in it. And it's difficult. We find ourselves in a time where we're doing this, digitally because we don't have a lot of other options. So sometimes, and I think certainly my experience has been actually it's not quite as bad as I thought it would have been. If I tried to get all of us together this evening in one place in central Melbourne, it probably wouldn't have happened. So there are advantages, but I also then wonder, in terms of meditation practice, I think there really is something to being in the same room together, and I don't really think that. That's been explored or that's in the research. My sense is just we just that's kind of a default assumption. Well, these are groups, and that's the nature of their organization. But there's been really, and Neil, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think there's been any real kind of comparisons to, group-based practices versus sort of one-on-one or individualistic type practices. Are you aware of anything?
I think I have seen a review that included sort of a meta-analysis approach. Mm-hmm. And it included whether they were groups or individual sessions as part of the variability. And I'm pretty sure it did explain some of the variability in outcome,
okay.
But along with other factors as well. It wasn't
a
huge explanation, but it was there. My query on this, though, would be whether we include that group factor as part of the actual technique, or whether it's an additional kind of bonus feature. So if we're talking about, the practice of mindfulness meditation, is doing it in a group sort of intrinsically part of the mindfulness meditation process, or is that something that's extra and additional, but also beneficial? And I would say the latter probably. I think it's a bonus. It's the cherry on top. But you will get the mechanisms of action of mindfulness meditation engaged, even doing it not in a group, would be what I would think.
Yeah, I'd agree with you, Neil. What you get is the motivation to practice in a group. And you also, and the cherry on top, it might even be, there's something about the sharing of subjective experience you're sharing. I mean, you do that in therapy too, but there's something about, people often say in Mbsr and MBCT that I haven't told anyone that, and they've just told 16 people it. Or I don't feel like I've been listened to like this in my marriage for 20 years. Like, because it's a context set up to listen very carefully, because we're not only, and this is the integration of the practice with the group. So it's not, in the moment of someone really sharing something difficult in the group, that's absolutely scary for all of us, a skillful teacher will say, God, that really has touched me. I feel a bit really moved by that and a bit overwhelmed. How about we all just take a moment, and how do we bear that? How do we bear that Bronwyn's just told us this? Like, this is big. And so we all sit there together for 3 minutes and feel our feelings. So that's the skillful kind of interlinking of the interpersonal kind of resonance of exploring suffering together with the practice. And people feel then able to speak rather than, holy hell, I don't want to hear about that story, or that reminds me of what happened to me as a kid, or they're able to like self-regulate in that 3-5 minutes and then say something skillful. I was really moved by when you said that, or that, and so skillful sharing comes out of it. So it's such a, I think in this pedagogy of the MBPs, and it's not just Mbsr, there's something really profound going on in that integration of people being able to find intimacy. And it needs to be 8 years long, not 8 weeks, as we know. How do we do that?
Yeah, but the other thing I think that's important in what you said, Tim, is that the nature, the skillful navigation as the instructor. This is something when I teach clinical psychology students, one of the things I often encourage them to do is participate in group psychotherapy. I often say it's an amazing skill to see group psychotherapy done well. And I think the same thing of group meditation instruction. I think being able to manage the kind of the stuff that comes out in these dialogues, the realizations that people have, and to not only hold it yourself as kind of the leader, but also to kind of make it okay for the group as a whole to hold it. There's a lot of skill that's required in that. And so that, I guess that's another thing that worries me a little bit, I guess, is sort of, if we're paring that back, or if we're sort of allowing people without the background or the experience or the necessary training to kind of lead or run these groups, or if we're making it an individual thing, are we losing that? You know, are we losing the skill that goes along with, you know, the sort of people who have practiced for a long time, or who have acquired the kind of the necessary skill set, I suppose, to sort of manage that kind of group context.
Yeah. And it's a skill set, and it's also a personal practice issue, like doing retreats and really being able to be that person that you were talking about, Patrick, who has walked it a bit and knows a bit more about it than the participants at least. But also, yeah, making it I think to teach successfully or skillfully or well or heartfully, I think there has to be something about living from that paradigm. So actually dealing with your own moments of suffering. Christina Feldman said this beautiful thing. She's an insight teacher in the UK, said, you know, if we're really practicing mindfulness meditation, and she teaches MBCT teachers, she said, if we're really practicing this stuff, when bad things happen to us, we should be less surprised than if we hadn't been practicing mindfulness meditation. So really making it your paradigm makes you less fearful about when people are having big stuff in the group, maybe too. So it's a matter of teacher training too, isn't it? Like, what do we encourage people to do if they're going to be running these groups? Yeah.
I guess, and that sort of kind of leads me to thinking, and I'm apologize for, I'm hoping to redirect this to you, Patrick, but you know, what do you think? And this is sort of the number of people ask this questions. I've asked myself this question a lot of times. You know, what do you think happens when we remove these practices from their traditional context? You know, I guess that even maybe a further question is, because I suspect your answer is, you know, to some extent, I'm anticipating you're going to say it's okay a bit. I guess my real question is, to what extent can we remove them from some of the traditional context, the traditional supporting features, and still have them work in the way that we think they ought to?
I think that's a interesting way to frame it. To what extent is it possible to escape the tradition? And it may not be, because the tradition isn't something that kind of somebody invented and said, this is what we're going to do, this is the tradition. The tradition was developed over centuries because it worked. So if you want to, if the question is, how do we go deep into mindfulness meditation? Then if you simply approach that openly without prejudices, you will find yourself doing a lot of things that the tradition does. You might give them different names, and you know, there might be people might be wearing different uniforms, and you might, and so on. But you'll probably end up doing pretty much the same things, because it's essentially pragmatic. This is what works. But one of the debates about the role of ethics and secular mindfulness. Mbsr doesn't teach the ethical foundations that the Buddha talked about. This is a problem with Mbsr. For me, that is not a problem, because to me, Mbsr has its own particular specialty. It does this. It doesn't do everything. It just does this. But if you're doing a meditation practice and you want calm and harmony in your mind, after some time, you will notice that if your life has no calm and no harmony because you're living unethically, your meditation doesn't work very well. And then you realize that if I want my meditation to actually get better, I've got to clean up my act. And that's the way the Buddha talked about ethics. He put a very close relationship between what he called sila, ethics, and samadhi, meditation. And the role of ethics is to harmonize, is to develop psychological harmony, harmony within myself, and social harmony, harmony in my relationships. Because if I don't have that, my meditation practice is going to be difficult, and I'm going to be blocked in my progress. And so this sort of thing becomes obvious as the meditation develops. And then you realize, oh, if I want to go deeper, I have to clean up my act. Now, maybe I don't want to go deeper. Maybe if I want to keep my current lifestyle, but with a better meditation to help me sleep better, fine. Then you can stay at that level and you can continue. But you realize that if you want to keep going into this, things have to change. Supporting conditions have to change. And so that's where you get, I think, what you could call the tradition. That's where it comes in, both in the sense that you find yourself doing the same things anyway, but also in the sense that more traditional teachings will make more sense to you. You begin to realize, oh, that's why they emphasize that, because you can already feel it in your own experience.
I'm quite fond of Mark Epstein, and you know, I often think this notion he's talked about, this idea that you know, you shouldn't go about the process of dissolving the ego, the sense of self, unless you've already got an established ego or sense of self. So that sort of encouragement that you know, maybe sort of going full on into meditation practice when, you know, there's things there that are troubling, that are problematic, that, you know, you're maybe severely mentally ill, that pulling at the strings of that, you know, when you haven't actually resolved those issues first, is probably not a good idea. You know, it's, you know, pulling at strings of a loosely knit ball of yarn is likely to lead to the ball unraveling in a very unpredictable way. And yeah, so it's something that, and there's a question here. I think I have to read it because the nature of this question sort of starts to get at this exact idea. But so there's a statement here saying, attributed to Mathieu Ricard, that suffering is the result of ignorance. Ignorance in essence is the belief in a truly existing self, and in the solidity of the phenomenon. And the participant is sort of asking about depersonalization. I think this is a really interesting question. So wondering about the difference between liberation from the sense of self and sort of the, you know, the shackles of ego-based identity versus a psychotic break, right? Or sort of the kind of serious adverse effects that one might experience in you know, in a traditional psychological context. You know, and my immediate response to that is like, this is just this is a really tricky, sticky area that I've had many discussions with a lot of Buddhist experts, a lot of monks, nuns, Buddhist teachers, and I think, you know, it's really hard to sort of delineate where, you know, where it's sort of just part of the process. You know, I know a number of monks and nuns, and I know a number of teachers, very, very prominent teachers who sort of will say, well, you know, if it's not working, you just need to practice harder. And my response to that is absolutely not. You know, if someone is floridly psychotic, you know, you're not going to meditate your way out of that. You know, you need to go and get some psychiatric help. But then on the other side of things, you know, I guess there's this question of, well, you know, when it's subtle, when there are these sort of little differences, or and you know, I guess it depends on if it is kind of, if there is that ethical shell or that ethical frame that Patrick is mentioning, if that, you know, in Mbsr, you know, John Kabat-Zinn sort of suggests that some of that is implicit. Now we could debate that and discuss that, but you know, over the years, and I think in some of John's more recent writings, he's kind of just said, actually, Mbsr is a placeholder for the Dharma, and you know, I kind of snuck it in the back door, essentially, is what he really says. So there is still a lot of ethics in Mbsr, I think, even though it's not as explicit as it is in the Buddhist traditions. But I guess I don't know, what do all of you think about this idea? You know, how do we deal with the overlap of these disciplines? You know, with the idea of sort of what the traditions suggest are going to happen, and what sort of contemporary psychology, neuroscience, psychiatry suggests, and how do we make that work?
Could I just comment that quote from Mathieu Ricard is very interesting, because he's coming out of the Tibetan tradition, which has a highly developed philosophical tradition going for centuries, and he's giving a philosophical statement. Actually, I've just lost the question. It just vanished.
Oh, sorry, that was my fault.
Oh, you answered it, do you? Yeah, here it is. So suffering is the result of ignorance, and ignorance is the belief in a truly existing self. That is an ideological, philosophical statement. It is not an empirical statement. And it's perfectly, I have no argument with it, but myself, because I'm a Buddhist. But I wouldn't for a moment suggest that anybody coming to meditate is supposed to discover that their self does not truly exist. In other words, they're getting a concept, a philosophical concept, and they're trying to jam it onto their experience. And in the process, that will create problems, inevitably. And what I like to really emphasize with my students is, you are meditators. You are not philosophers. We are not studying Buddhist philosophy. We are studying the nature of our own experience. And in fact, when you look at the Buddha himself, and I don't think he was a philosopher either, he never said there is no self. He said, this experience is not self. This thought is not self. This feeling is not self. He basically, what he said was, look for one, and tell me if you can find one. He didn't say there wasn't one. He said, try to find one. What would it look like? What would it feel like? What does it take to be a self? It's quite a different approach. It's more open-ended and empirical. And one of the things I think is quite strong about the Dharma in Australia is that we don't have to work underneath the burden of all these dogmas that have developed over the centuries. Rather, we can look at the Buddha himself, who was before Buddhism, and just use his framework to embark on our own empirical investigation. What is the nature of my experience? Because whatever it is, that's what it is. And the other thing is, of course, you can have an experience in meditation, and depending on which philosophical tradition you're working in, you can say that experience is self, or you could say that experience is no self. And it could be exactly the same experience, depending on which philosophical tradition you're talking about. So it's very dangerous when people get caught up in these concepts and think that their job as a meditator is to make these concepts real in their own experience. That's putting the cart before the horse. The job is to clarify the experience. Full stop. That's it. That's my anti-tradition rant.
My experience of this whole, like, if anyone goes through a change process, whether it's through good psychotherapy or a mindfulness meditation course or a retreat or a process that unfolds over time, longer than those things probably, what happens in them is wellness seems to increase alongside not being so rigidly attached to I have to be a certain way. So people in psychotherapy come into psychotherapy saying I can't possibly be the person I want to be because I'm feeling this vulnerability and crying all the time. What happens in the psychotherapy is, I can now have a bigger version of myself where crying actually makes sense and it's meaningful. I can be vulnerable sometimes. I can be enraged sometimes. I can be contemptuous sometimes. And it's not, doesn't wreck my universe. And I think you learn the same thing in good mindfulness training, whether it's Buddhist-based or more secular, that you're starting to observe the process that's unfolding and noticing all these arisings, and you actually start not identifying so much. You know it's a little part of you that bubbles up in certain contexts, but it doesn't define me. I don't have to fight to not be that contempt or not be that vulnerability. And I think that, so these, framing the question of, like there are people with serious mental illness that mindfulness isn't going to help at all, probably. But I don't think we need to confuse that with this talk about self, not self. I think a healthy sense of self grows with the Dharma and it grows with good psychotherapy. And it's that reflective capacity to not have to own every bit of you that bubbles up in any moment and think that you have to defend that or promote it, or it's actually stuff, and it's shaped by the family you are in, the culture you're in, whether you've got money or not, you know.
Yeah, I think when you talk to experienced meditators, they know exactly who they are, and they accept that. That's not a big problem.
Oh.
And whoever it is that they are is not perfect. It never will be.
Some of them more so than others. So that, look, there's this interesting question here, and I think there's a number of questions seen, with the phrase "mind the hype" in them, and questions about sort of the validity of the data, and sort of what the research evidence suggests. And I just wanted to quickly comment on that and get Neil's thoughts as well. It's interesting that I think there's a question here sort of about, are we approaching the research of mindfulness and meditation kind of wrong? Are we coming at it from the wrong angle? So there's a question of, are we building an evidence base for mindfulness-based interventions kind of in a disease-centric way? And should we instead sort of think of it as a means to improve well-being in spite of disease? And I actually think that's quite an interesting question. The reality, I think, a lot of the data, a lot of the scientific studies that have been conducted, and Patrick has gone so far as to say it in a previous conversation that he viewed a lot of the science as marketing, which I think is very provocative. But I'm not sure that I entirely disagree. I'm not as gutsy as Patrick might be to say that, or at least there's more implications for me in doing so. but I think it's interesting that the evidence, in my opinion, isn't that robust. It's okay. There's a decent number of studies that suggest that the structured programs in particular seem to work. They seem to help people, but there's a lot of bias. The findings don't necessarily generalize in the way that we'd like them to. There aren't enough of them. There certainly aren't enough of the studies sort of looking outside of the traditional randomized controlled trial model. And I guess and so expanding on that even, and this is something I'd love to hear Neil's thoughts about. One of the things that was so striking in the film was the mismatch between kind of Shannon's experience. Subjectively, it really felt like things got better, and her kind of well-being was the thing she came down on. And that was really inconsistent with kind of the data. The data sort of suggested kind of like maybe there was something there. If you crossed both your eyes and you looked sideways, and maybe there were some interesting, right? But and I know this is something Shannon struggled with. But what do you think about that, Neil? How do you make sense of that? What do you?
I think it's really tough to find the right things to measure in terms of the neuroscience and the physiological measurements. We're just not clear on how, I guess, strongly they relate to the changes in mental health, which physiological changes are the most important, even which physiological changes reflect like improvements. I know that in like certain mental illnesses, you can get markers that are increased when the mental illness is more severe. So there's a marker of error awareness that seems to go up in people with anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder. Their brain is more prone to noticing when they've made an error or a mistake. And there's research showing that those brain responses are decreased by mindfulness practice. But then in healthy controls and people with depression, there's research that's showing that error awareness related brain activity is actually increased by mindfulness practice. So it's not even clear what the marker is in terms of biology, physiology, that we're trying to change with mindfulness practice. And it's not clear in which direction we're trying to change it. And it might be in the opposite direction for different mental illnesses or different conditions, for example. And so I think the issue with the approach that all of the scientists in the film took is that we're trying to find a biological marker when we don't know what the biological marker change might actually mean. We have a good idea for some of them, but we're not sure enough to say, okay, that reflects improved well-being. And then when you add on top of that the variability across different measurement time periods, which with a lot of neuroimaging techniques, for example, that we use, they don't actually have good retest reliability. So if you test them at one time and then that same person at a different time, the person might show different results at both of those time periods without actually doing anything, in terms of an intervention at all. So with the variability between measurements being that high for a lot of biological measurements, it's pretty tricky to say after a mindfulness, practice that they've changed in a positive way or not. So I think that was the issue with testing just one person, which I guess is why they test large numbers in studies, so that we can get, on average, the results seem to point in a specific direction. Having said that, I think Shannon's point overall about how she felt, when we're considering whether a mindfulness intervention is working for us personally, I think that's the most important thing. It's whether we personally feel better, not whether the biology or the physiology or the neuroscience says that it's going to enhance a certain marker or not. Whether it works for us.
Look, I'm by no means a reductionist, and I don't have considerable faith in biomarkers, but there is, I'm a natural skeptic. I can't help it. I'm quite pessimistic. I always have been. I don't know that that's going to change. Is it enough? Like, if we're feeling good, like if I've heard a couple of people comment that, if subjective well-being improves, isn't that, shouldn't we just take people's word for it? And I guess what I'm wondering is, we can convince, as human beings, we can convince ourselves of a hell of a lot of things. We can be convinced by other people, particularly charismatic individuals, that things are good for us, or that we're doing well, or that we're benefiting from them or enjoying them when we're really not. Or maybe we are a little, but I guess, there's also opportunity costs. We're investing time in a particular practice because it's led by a particularly charismatic teacher who has sold lots of books, and we're going on these retreats and we're paying all this money, and it kind of feels right. Maybe it feels good, but if there's no evidence, like, I guess, what does that mean? And what responsibility do we have to, and this is not just for you, Neil, and I'm not centering on you, I think it's for the panel as a whole. What responsibility do we have as researchers, as teachers, as clinicians, to actually address some of these issues and think about, when is it a personal endeavor? When is it about a person sort of seeking to fulfill their own goals and wants, versus when we're talking about how do we recommend at a public policy level, at a school level? I mean, mindfulness in schools is huge in Australia. When is that okay?
They're two different questions, I guess, right? So on a personal level, if you're being introspective and honest with yourself, and you do notice that the benefits do occur from a mindfulness practice, then at a personal level, I would say it's the right thing for that person. But you're right, at a systematic level, a research level, and a teaching level, if we're making recommendations for large proportions of the population to try this, or that it works as a treatment, I think you're right. We do need to verify that there are mechanisms of action that work, and that we can effectively target those mechanisms of action, and not just sort of have a vague sense that maybe it is improving things. I think that is important.
Tim, do you have particular thoughts about that with respect to, as someone who practices as a psychotherapist, and also runs Mbsr groups and sits in kind of the space in between, what are your thoughts about that? When do you tend to sort of shift more to one versus the other?
Yeah, I think listening deeply is important to the person's context. So sometimes I recommend people don't do Mbsr, having had the interview with them, because it's just not going to be the right context, or they're wanting something that this thing just can't offer, or I can hear that their life is set up in a way that they're no way going to be able to have the space to even, fruitfully attend the class, let alone do any practice. So there's all sorts of contextual things that need to be listened to, but also, sometimes I might do some practice with someone who I think, is, like, I think my personal experience is people with strong OCD kind of experiences and ways of organising their information processing really can have a hard time in mindfulness courses. So I might, and I would refer something else. I would refer them to something else. I'd want to know about the kinds of traumatic experiences people have had, a little bit about that and how they understand that now, what they're up for, and people are great at being able to tell you in all sorts of ways, directly, indirectly, if you listen, to whether this is going to be a goer. And, with some people I'll say, look, let's keep in touch every single week. I think that you could get something out of this, but let's keep in touch because it's going to be a bit hairy. Are you up for that? And if I'm talking to them like that, they know what a bit hairy means. So I think it's a conversation that I would engage with someone, and I can't, because the evidence is such that it's, it is not definitive. And I have to say, look, this is what we know about what it can help. My experience of my own anxiety, I can speak about it myself. And so, conversation, I think, in any clinical context, that's what you do, I think. Listen well and see, and really lay out options for people too. Sometimes I suggest people go and do one-on-one, like something like MICBT, rather than do the group thing, because the group thing is just going to be provocative for them. Sometimes I think the group thing is going to be better, so I'll say that. So, but yeah, there's no easy answers here, is there? Because we do have responsibility. And the other thing that occurred to me about the research is that it doesn't happen, like it's not the best things that get ticked off as the things that work either. Like researchers, you know, you guys probably know much more than I, like funding, what's fashionable, what gets a whole lot of, like CBT's had a huge amount of studies and numbers, and a lot of other modalities hasn't in the same way. So that looks like it's got the power to say it's good for trauma, it's good for this. And, you know, I have some questions about the whole setup. So just what comes out from research as this is a good thing, there's a lot of other stuff going on.
Oh, look, I have a lot of questions as well, and I'm sure Neil does also. And for everybody who's listening, please write to your representative and complain.
Exactly.
I was recently told by someone that a philanthropic organization that I had approached, and also in an NHMRC grant that I had applied for recently. And in both of these cases, you know, in one I was essentially told, you know, MBSR, MBCT, the MBPs, they've all been researched to death. It's done. We don't need to know anything more about that. It's boring. And I was shocked. I was like, really? Like, because, you know, when I look at the distribution, when I look at how many studies have been done on the mindfulness-based practices, it pales in comparison to something like CBT.
Yeah.
And then I sort of had other things where I sort of suggested, like, well, we need to look at, you know, how much of what type of practice over time people need to do, who's well suited to these practices. Can we get identifiers of who should be engaging in these things versus other practices? You know, can we kind of make predictions about who should be doing the kinds of things you're saying, Tim, one-on-one versus group versus they shouldn't be doing it at all? I was told, well, that sounds really incremental. That's boring. And my thought was, are you kidding? Like, this is the exact stuff that we need to know if we're actually going to be able to make reasonable recommendations to people. So it's really frustrating, I think, and you're right that some of the way that the research enterprise works is such that you know, there's a large group of sort of particularly charismatic individuals that have done well in the past, and some of sort of their past success dictates their future success. And if it's not new and exciting and sexy to some extent, you know, many people are sort of not really interested in looking at it anymore. So many people think this is a done deal. Yeah, so, and I think that's sort of something that Shannon has mentioned as well, that some of this is on, and a decent amount of this is on the media. You know, the way that these results and the ways that these studies and the ways that these findings are presented propose or suggest that it's a done deal, that it will work, that, you know, you should engage in these kinds of practices. And, you know, this idea that, you know, everyone's gonna go into this and feel amazing after, you know, if you really just want to be happy, you really want to be blissful, you know, go ahead and do this, do meditation, do mindfulness. Like, it couldn't possibly hurt. And like, and it's, you know, it's a transformative experience. And my response is often, and I know Neil and I've chatted on this before, like, if you're doing it right, I think, you know, you're just as likely to have some pretty unpleasant experiences as you are to have some pleasant ones. So
in fact, the whole course, like MBSR, is set up to explore unpleasant experience. I think that's kind of, I mean, it's also to savor the good, but there's a real big emphasis on turning towards the difficult, because that's what people have been avoiding. I mean, good therapy also is helping us turn towards the difficult.
No, people inherently are very good at turning towards the good. It's, you know, we don't have any problems with that.
Yeah, exactly.
We're, you know, turning away from the hard things is, you know, nobody needs to learn how to do that.
No, it's adaptive. We don't want to know.
So, go ahead, Patrick.
Nicholas, about the something that I think is really shocking is there's never been an experimental study to show how much we need to do to obtain positive effects, and whether, you know, 45 minutes a day is the right amount, which is the sort of gold standard recommended by Mbsr and MBCT. And to say that it's a done deal and we know everything about mindfulness when we don't even know how much you need to do per day, I find that so shocking. And the fact that so many researchers will be struggling to answer that question and desperate to, and struggling to get the funding to do that is just, it's such a shock when you think of, and you hear responses like your funding bodies. So.
Yeah, and it's probably an incredibly complex, well, you would know better than I by a long shot, but incredibly difficult question to answer. Like, I'm always astounded in MBSR, or even like people go on retreat and they get, yeah, but in MBSR, people might not practice much, but get a huge amount out of it because they're basically well-regulated, well-resourced, makes perfect sense, and cognitively they can take it in and start really using it in their life. Other people, chronic pain, addiction stuff, depression, anxiety, really need to practice their asses off to get traction. And so how much one needs to do is really based on your context again, I think, and the kind of brain you were born with, let alone the brain that developed in your family, or, you know, even whether you felt worthy of learning anything new. Like all those things factor in, don't they? And some people are just going to have to practice more to get the same benefits than others. And it really depends on all the causes and conditions that they're working with and what's contributing. And that makes it hard for you guys
Definitely.
to get in your tail of it because people are coming with all their complexity.
Yeah, which is,
And it makes it hard in the meditation retreats because people discover that meditation is not a democracy, that some people do better than others and make faster progress than others, and some people are naturally gifted at it, and some people are just terrible at it.
So what, I guess there's an interesting question, and a number of people sort of are kind of posting this suggestion, but you know, do you think, like, is there a particular type of, you know, Tim, you kind of mentioned people in the context of MBSR that you would think of maybe are not well suited to it. Patrick, in your experience, is there a particular type of person, or is there any characteristics or features that you observe, or sort of in your, you know, over the years that you sort of noted, okay, these are the kinds of things that are likely to contribute to someone doing well in the context of retreat or meditation practice?
Strictly speaking, it's impossible to tell before they get started. Overall, rich people seem to have more difficulty. I don't know why this is, but it's been my observation that rich people tend to be dharmically stupid, whereas poorer people tend to be dharmically much more intelligent. It's partly the amount of tension that people carry, and that can include physical tension, deep layers of physical tension. For example, the amount of suffering that a person has gone through. So some really seriously good meditators are people who are essentially ex-addicts. Of course, from the Buddha's perspective, they are intimate with the first truth. They really know suffering. And that gives them a huge advantage when they come to meditate. Whereas perhaps in another context, you know, it might be quite different. But it's really impossible to pin down. It's this huge range, and you just don't know until someone starts. And then you see how it unfolds, how they blossom or don't blossom, depending on the conditions.
But also maybe to do with the time in a person's life. Like sometimes people come to MBSR and they've just been around the block so often, they're just sick to death of it, and they're just really prepared to put everything into this inquiry and practice. But maybe 3 years ago they wouldn't have engaged in the same way at all. So it's so many factors.
So some people are very, very happy with their lives and they don't want to actually look at their lives. Other people are very unhappy with their lives and don't want to look at their lives. And some people are very unhappy with their lives and really want to look at their lives. And that last category, they're going to do well.
Yeah, it's an interesting caveat. I think these caveats about the practice are really important as well. I often, when I give presentations about, particularly sort of to clinicians who want to learn about mindfulness and sort of are thinking about doing it, I often reference David O. Russell's film I Heart Huckabees, which is, if you haven't seen it, it's a 2004 film that sort of depicts David O. Russell's interpretation of Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy. I'm going to guess that it's not, you know, terribly accurate in terms of Buddhism per se, but there's this wonderful scene in the film where the main character, Jason Schwartzman, sort of goes to this existential detective and asks, you know, says, I really want to, I want to know the big everything. Like I want to understand it all. I want to dig deep below the surface and know everything there is to know about life. And I really want to understand it. And the response that the existential detective gives essentially is, are you sure? You know, most people, when they explore below the surface, find that there's a lot there that they really don't want anything to do with. And most people are quite happy just staying on the surface of things. You know, are you really sure you want to actually dig down there and look at that? Because once we once we open up that box, there's no closing it. Maybe you should just go home and let sleeping dogs lie. And I often sort of say to people that it's great. It's a great sort of example of the exact kind of caveats that we should be providing people before we engage them in this kind of work, because I don't think there's enough of that. I don't think we're sort of warning people about what they might find below that surface. And there's a lot. There's a lot that people have not been willing to look at, or wanting to look at, or able to look at for various reasons.
That reminds me, Nicholas, of a point that somebody raised earlier about I think, Patrick, you were saying about the philosophy of no self versus just, I guess, the practice of it. I always look at that sort of thing through a neuroscience lens, thinking about, this is probably a bit of a simplification, but people talk about the default mode network brain activity, reflecting the habitual self. So just the thought pattern of the mind that is habitual, automatic. And if we're thinking about, the philosophy of no self, one perspective on that might be that we can cognitively think our way into not having any default mode network activity. I don't actually think that's the way that mindfulness works. I think what we might be doing is training our brain to habitually just accept exactly where we are and accept the things as they are, and accept the self, or the temporary nature of the self, as sort of the truth of reality, as just a habitual automatic process. So it's not like, I'm a good meditator today or I'm a bad meditator. It's just, this is what meditation is like for me today. And as a habit of the brain, when it becomes that habit, it's not a cognitive philosophical question that we need to pose to ourselves. Is there a self? Do I exist? It's automatic. Just the recognition that things are temporary. This is just another experience, and it will pass. And I think about, if we're using sort of a neuroscientific lens on that, to think about the circuits of our brain and the networks, strengthening the habit of that, I guess, as a deeper philosophical perspective, that we're not consciously thinking through as a philosophy, but just an automatic outlook on the world, as being sort of the outcome that might be most desirable from meditation or mindfulness practice. If you reach that point, you're not going to worry about whether you're a good person or a bad person, a good meditator, a bad meditator. You're just going to automatically view things as temporary, just experiences, and not things to be suffered through.
So unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our allotted time. And I'm aware there are a number of questions we haven't been able to answer. I ran this intentionally for an hour and a half. I know they often only go for an hour. The goal was sort of to try and answer more questions. But as is always the case, you always end up, I think, with more, particularly if the discussion is good, you end up with way more questions than you do answers. Personally, I think having more questions than answers is a good thing. I think the answers are cheap and easy to come by, and the questions are what is really interesting. But I imagine many people are feeling a bit dissatisfied by that response. If so, there's your first introduction to Buddhism. Yeah. But I guess the one thing I'd like to do in sort of just kind of starting to wrap things up is if we could just kind of go Brady Bunch round robin style, the way that I'm looking at the screen here, and start with Tim and then Patrick and Neil, and I'll say a few words to close off myself. Just the 20 to 30 second version of if people wanted to get in touch or want to help you or support your work, how they can do so. And then I think, the short version of, if people really wanted to do something like Shannon did, they want to try and commit to something like a year of meditation practice or mindfulness practice, where would you suggest they start? So we'll start with you, Tim.
I think working with a teacher is better than an app or a book or an online thing that hasn't got engagement with others and a teacher. So, and evidence is good in terms of enough practice, maybe. I mean, there's many questions about this as we've raised. And yeah, there's a lot of good teachers, I think, in Australia in the Dharma traditions and in, more secular contexts. So search out and find someone who's just done a decent training, I think. Yeah.
And does the Mindfulness Training Institute sort of have records, or can it help people to identify teachers?
Yep, indeed. So the Mindfulness Training Institute has a website where you can search for a teacher in Australia and New Zealand, and all the teachers, you'll be able to, check out their qualifications, their interests. Like some teachers are physios, some are psychologists, some are pain specialists, some are yoga teachers. So there's a whole diversity. So you can actually search out a teacher that, in your area that kind of matches your interests, a bit like what Patrick is saying about pursuing, what you think is going to help. Yeah, so that's a good place to start.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Patrick?
I think the only place you can start is an app, then an app is a good thing. But really, I think it's good to see if you can find a meditation group in your area that you can join up. These days, of course, the groups are all virtual, which online, that could be good. But you need you need community. You need a group. It's very difficult. You have to have a will of stainless steel to do meditation alone. You really need group support. So to join any group where you can meditate together and people you can talk to, that's a really good place to start. And then look for retreats that are available. These days I'm doing virtual retreats. So they're based on time zone rather than location. There's one starting tomorrow, Australian Eastern Standard Time, and I've got another one in June, and WA Malaysia time in July. So that will be the thing about the virtual retreat, which is people find really interesting, is that you're doing it at home. So it's a householders retreat. And it eliminates a lot of the problems with cost, because there's very little cost involved, because you don't have to pay to go somewhere and pay for accommodation and food. So it's much cheaper. And you're much more in control about how much you engage with it. You might just engage with the amount of time that there's people are gathering, and then just go about your daily business and be mindful. Or you might set aside your life and really practice. But with the retreats that I'm running, you also get the one-on-one interviews with me again over Zoom. So you get that, which I think is absolutely central if you're going to develop the craft, is the one-on-one back and forth interview with the teacher. That's really important. But you can find out about my stuff. I'll put my website on the chat list. It's dharmasalon.net. If you Google me, I am not the American serial killer, and I am not the Canadian singer-songwriter. I'm the other one. Okay, I'll just send it off on the chat.
Yep, it's happening.
And Neil?
So in terms of our work, we're always looking to recruit and test participants who have experience with meditation practice. So if you want to have your brain scanned for science, you can find probably my email address either on the Monash University website or through the Epworth Centre for Innovation and Mental Health, where I work. And in terms of how to form a practice, I think it's been mentioned a few times tonight, commitment being one of the most important things, and probably one of the hardest things when you're just starting out as well. So the way I started myself was to just set 1 week and make sure I sat for at least 10 minutes every day of that 1 week, and just set that initial goal. And then once I reached that, set another slightly harder and longer goal to build up that habit, to make sure it's consistent, you're committed to it, you can do it, and don't worry or beat yourself up with it if you if you miss one. Just get back to it.
So I would just echo what everyone else has said. I think I think as Patrick mentioned as well, there's a number of really great resources, and there's lots of things available online at the moment. On my personal website, I've tried to repost some of the things that Tricycle has shared. So Tricycle Magazine and a number of other Mind and Life and a number of organizations are making available links to various retreats that both Buddhist and secular centers worldwide at the moment. I know John Kabat-Zinn, I think, is running almost daily groups. It's probably not the best place, sort of, if you're a total novice and you've never done it before to go. If you've never done it, I really would suggest you engage with an experienced teacher. And if you're really considering sort of getting into it seriously, it's fine to, I think, as Patrick said, start slow and build up. Don't jump into a 10-day intensive retreat as your first way of going. And I think really my main point would be really consider what it is that you want to get out of it and really explore that in depth. If you're looking to resolve issues to do with mental health or wellness, seriously consider whether, meditation mindfulness is sort of the best potential solution for you, and find someone to talk to about that is prepared to give you an answer you may not like, and not just take you in and pad their pockets. As in the case, any of the members in the panel today, I'm sure would be quite prepared to send you away if you weren't appropriate for what they were doing, and I think that's incredibly important. I often tell people, I think as valuable as sort of hearing about where people did train or how they did learn and to do what they do, even more valuable is what they don't tell you. So, I think if certain details about how people have trained and what tradition they've learned in is missing, that often for me is a red flag. As for research, Emily, we're always looking to recruit participants. We've got an ongoing study at the moment where we're asking people to give us a few minutes a week for 8 weeks to try and get some sense of some of these questions about the effects of dose response, how practice works and how it may lead to benefits. Lots of references, things to my papers, things like that can both be found through the University of Melbourne's link for my website. So you can just type my name and find an expert, or on my personal website, nicholastvandam.com. So on behalf of the panelists and behalf of the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences, and on behalf of Shannon Harvey, whose film has inspired all of this discussion, thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you, Tim and Patrick and Neil, for taking the time out of your evenings away from your families and loved ones to be here with us and to share your wisdom and knowledge with the group. Thank you all for your time, your energy, your wisdom, your compassion. And I wish everyone all the best, and please do get in touch with us, if we can be of help as you explore practice, explore research, explore meditation and mindfulness.